It's a scene that's all too familiar, a local market bustling with activity, the hum of everyday transactions filling the air, and customers shuffling through aisles, lost in their own world. But what seems like just another mundane day is about to be disrupted by something far more significant, an encounter that will test the boundaries of kindness, patience, and human decency. John, a 21-year-old with Down syndrome, is starting his first day on the job, full of excitement and nervous energy. He walks through the doors of the market with a sense of pride, his uniform neatly pressed, his name tag a small symbol of a fresh start. But John doesn't know yet that what's supposed to be a simple shift at work will soon become a defining moment in his life. As he carefully navigates the aisles, learning the ropes of bagging groceries and assisting customers, he's unaware of the storm quietly building around him, a storm in the form of one impatient, rude customer. This customer's cruelty will break through the quiet chaos of the store, casting a dark cloud over John's day. And yet, amid the harshness and judgment, a surprising figure is quietly watching, taking in every detail of the scene. What happens next will change everything. Just when it seems like John is at his breaking point, someone steps in. Someone with the strength and authority to shift the power dynamic entirely. The scene is about to unfold in a way no one, not even John, could have anticipated. In a world where cruelty often feels like it has the upper hand, a single act of kindness and intervention can make all the difference. This story isn't just about one person's struggle in the face of injustice. It's a reminder of the power of human connection, the importance of standing up for others, and the unexpected heroes who emerge when we need them most. As John faces down one of the most painful moments of his life, he has no idea that someone is watching, ready to step in and offer him the support he so desperately needs. What happens next is more than just a moment of intervention. It's a lesson in empathy, strength, and the power of standing up for what's right. Stay with us as this unforgettable story unfolds. John's first day at work. John had always dreamed of this day, his first official job at the local market. As he walked through the automatic doors, a sense of pride washed over him. The bright fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a calm glow over the store, but it was the feeling of wearing his uniform, the name tag on his chest, that made him feel like he belonged. This was more than just a job to him. It was a chance to prove to the world, and most importantly to himself, that he could do it. He had always been known for his infectious energy, his kindness, and his determination to keep moving forward, no matter what obstacles lay in his path. But today wasn't just about the work. It was about finding a place in a world that often felt too big, too fast, and too harsh for someone like him. John had always been a sensitive soul, someone who felt deeply even when his emotions were hidden behind a smile. Growing up with a father figure who wasn't exactly the role model he needed had left scars that went beyond the physical. His stepfather, a man who seemed to view John's presence as nothing more than an inconvenience, made it clear that John wasn't welcome. The words he'd heard as a child, "You'll never amount to anything, you're nothing but dead weight," had been etched into John's heart like a permanent stain. But those words didn't define him. He didn't let them. Today was a new day. The past didn't matter, not when John was finally stepping into his own with the tools to take charge of his life. He had been trained, taught the intricacies of organizing products, of bagging groceries, of navigating the quick-moving world of retail. John knew that it wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't as fast as others. He had his own rhythm, a pace that was different from the frantic speed around him. But that didn't mean he didn't deserve a chance. That didn't mean he couldn't find his place. When he met Jack, the store manager, for the first time, John saw in his eyes a warmth, an understanding that John hadn't always found. "Welcome to the team, John," Jack said with a reassuring smile. "We're happy to have you here." John, eager to prove himself, shook Jack's hand firmly. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll do my best." And for the rest of the day, that's exactly what he did. Despite his best efforts, John couldn't escape the whispers that followed him, the way people talked about him when they thought he couldn't hear. "He's a bit slow, isn't he?" one coworker muttered as John focused intently on stacking cans of soup. The words stung, but John kept going, pretending not to notice. He knew what he was capable of, even if others didn't. By the end of his shift, John was exhausted, but in the best way. He had done his job. He had shown up, and he had tried his hardest. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. John had made it through his first day. He had faced challenges, unspoken judgments, the discomfort of not quite fitting in, but he had kept moving forward. Little did he know, the day was about to take a turn he hadn't expected. The marketplace, once a place of promise, was now becoming a stage for something far darker. As John finished bagging the last customer's groceries, a deep sigh echoed from behind him. He glanced at the clock, relieved that his shift was almost over. But what John didn't notice was that someone in line was waiting, watching, and preparing to make his presence felt in a way that would change everything. The customer's abuse. Just as John felt a flicker of relief that his shift was drawing to a close, a new presence entered the store, one that would bring with it an entirely different kind of tension. Karen, a woman in her mid-40s with an air of superiority, strode into the market with a sharpness that cut through the atmosphere. Her heels clicked loudly against the tiled floor, each step echoing her impatience, and her face was already set in a permanent scowl, as though prepared for a fight she hadn't yet picked. From the moment she entered, it was clear that the world around her existed only to serve her needs. Nothing seemed right, nothing seemed fast enough, and nothing would meet her high standards. John, still working diligently, had no idea the storm was about to land right on his counter. His eyes were focused, his hands moving carefully as he bagged groceries for the previous customer. He didn't notice the narrowing of Karen's eyes as she assessed him, watching his every move with growing impatience. Her dissatisfaction wasn't hidden in the slightest. She made no effort to mask it. As she selected her items, her movements were quick, almost rushed, as if every second of her time was worth more than the next person's. Every tiny inconvenience, whether it be a child in her path or another shopper comparing prices, was met with audible scoffs and impatient glares. She had no time for anything but herself. When Karen finally reached John's checkout lane, her patience was already worn thin. She slammed her groceries onto the counter, the loud thud of each item emphasizing her frustration. John greeted her with his usual polite smile, offering a soft, "Good morning, ma'am," but her response was far from kind. Her eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto him with a mixture of disdain and impatience. "I hope it's a good morning," she shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "because I certainly don't have all day." John, ever the professional, did his best to maintain his composure. He began scanning her items, his movements careful, his hands steady. He double-checked the barcode on each product, ensuring everything was properly bagged. He could feel her gaze burning into him, her presence growing more oppressive with every second that passed. Every slight movement, no matter how small, seemed to make Karen's patience evaporate further. The tapping of her fingers on the counter became louder, more insistent. The longer it took for John to finish his task, the more Karen's irritation grew. Finally, unable to hold back her frustration any longer, Karen spoke up, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Is this going to take long?" she asked, her words sharp and deliberately biting. "Honestly, it feels like I'm watching this in slow motion." John's face turned a shade of red, his nerves beginning to fray under the pressure. His hands, once steady, started to tremble. He pushed himself to move faster, trying to finish before Karen's impatience overtook him entirely. But the more he rushed, the more clumsy he became. A package slipped from his hand and tumbled to the floor with a resounding crash. He scrambled to retrieve it, but by the time he stood up, Karen's voice had already risen in pitch, her ridicule echoing through the store. "Oh my God, he can't even hold a bag," Karen sneered, her words loud enough for everyone around her to hear. She glanced around the store as though seeking validation, her eyes scanning the other customers for some sign of agreement. John's heart sank, his body growing tense with humiliation. The words cut deeper than any of the harsh looks he had received in the past. Each insult, each sarcastic remark was like a weight that pressed down on him, making it harder to breathe. John tried to focus, trying to remind himself that he was just doing his job, that he had nothing to be ashamed of. But the pressure of the moment, the weight of Karen's eyes on him and the murmurs rising around him made it impossible to ignore the truth. He wasn't just being criticized for his work. He was being humiliated in front of everyone in the store. The feeling of being worthless, of being mocked for something as simple as his slow pace, was overwhelming. The memories of his stepfather's cruel words flooded back in waves, drowning him in the familiar sting of rejection. John's breathing became heavier, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. He knew he needed to finish the transaction, but every second felt like a mountain too steep to climb. As the bag slipped from his hands again, he felt the world around him closing in, the noise from the other customers blurring into a cacophony of judgment and pity. The pain of Karen's words cut so deeply, John wondered if he would ever find the strength to stand tall again. John's struggles, an emotional toll. The humiliation John felt in that moment was more than just the sting of harsh words. It was a deep, almost suffocating pressure that threatened to overwhelm him entirely. He had always carried a quiet determination in his heart, a desire to prove himself, to show the world that he could rise above the limitations others imposed on him. But as Karen's cruel words cut through the air, they dug into his soul, reopening old wounds that had never truly healed. John's mind flashed back to his childhood, to the memories that haunted him long before he ever stepped into this store. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table, his stepfather's voice ringing out like a constant barrage of condemnation. "You'll never amount to anything." The words had cut through him like a cold blade. "You're just dead weight. Nobody will ever want to be around you." Those were the phrases that had become the soundtrack of John's early years. Each day, each moment spent in that toxic environment, had chipped away at his sense of self-worth, leaving him feeling small, unseen, and unloved. But he had fought to overcome it. He had decided, somewhere deep inside, that those words would not define him, that he could rise above the cruelty, no matter how deeply it scarred him. But in the face of Karen's scorn, it all came rushing back. The shame, the sense of being unworthy, the crushing weight of feeling like he was never enough. It was as if time had folded in on itself, and John was once again that small boy, fighting to survive the verbal attacks of someone who should have protected him, but chose instead to belittle him. The memories were vivid and painful, each one pulling him deeper into a place of insecurity that threatened to swallow him whole. As John stood there, frozen in the face of Karen's tirade, he couldn't help but wonder, was this what the world truly thought of him? Was he destined to be nothing more than a burden, just like his stepfather had said? The tears that welled up in his eyes were not just for the immediate humiliation he was facing, but for every time in his life he had been made to feel less than, less capable, less worthy, less human. And yet, despite the overwhelming urge to collapse under the weight of it all, John fought to hold himself together. He had come too far to let someone else's cruelty dictate his future. He couldn't let Karen's words become the voice of his past. John glanced at the other customers who stood by, watching the scene unfold but not intervening. Their eyes flicked between him and Karen, some of them uncomfortable, others indifferent. Nobody spoke up, nobody said, "This isn't right." Instead, John stood alone, feeling the sting of isolation sharpen with every passing second. The weight of their silence was just as painful as Karen's words. It was as though they, too, were complicit in his humiliation. Unwilling to step in, unwilling to be the voice of reason in a moment where kindness was desperately needed. The tremor in John's hands worsened. His breath became shallow, his chest tight. The physical manifestations of his emotional turmoil were impossible to ignore. He felt like a child again, small and insignificant in a world that seemed determined to reject him. His hands fumbled, his movements growing more erratic as he tried to finish the transaction, but the effort felt futile. The weight of his anxiety, of his self-doubt, pressed down harder than the grocery bags he struggled to hold. And in that moment, John wondered if he would ever feel like he truly belonged. Would anyone ever see past his condition, past the struggles he faced each day, and recognize the person he truly was? Or would he always be the object of mockery, someone people could look down upon simply because they didn't understand? But amidst the sea of judgment, John's resolve didn't completely break. There was a quiet strength within him, a stubborn refusal to let his past shape his future. It flickered like a small flame in the pit of his stomach, reminding him that he was worth something, that he could overcome this moment, just like he had overcome the darkness of his childhood. He wasn't going to let Karen's cruelty steal that from him. But as he stood there, trembling, fighting to hold on to that small glimmer of strength, he had no idea that someone else, someone powerful, was watching from the sidelines. Someone who would change everything. Michael Jordan's intervention. The tension in the market had reached its breaking point. John stood there, his hands shaking, his breath uneven, trying desperately to focus on the task at hand while Karen's cruel words continued to echo in his mind. Each insult felt like another weight added to the already unbearable pressure. His whole body felt frozen, as though time had slowed down and the world around him had narrowed to nothing more than the judgmental stares of those watching him crumble under the weight of this cruel encounter. But in the midst of this suffocating silence, something shifted. A presence entered the scene, calm yet undeniably powerful. A firm yet steady voice broke through the noise of Karen's tirade. "That's enough," the words rang out, clear and unwavering, drawing the attention of everyone in the store. Karen froze for a brief moment, momentarily thrown off guard by the unexpected interruption. She glanced around, trying to assess who had dared to challenge her. Her gaze landed on a figure who had been quietly observing the scene from the side. Someone whose mere presence carried an undeniable authority. It was Michael Jordan. The legendary basketball player, known for his poise, his leadership, and his determination, now stood at the center of this escalating drama. His tall frame moved through the store with the same grace and confidence he had on the basketball court, each step purposeful and deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. The other customers who had been watching in silence now turned their heads, whispering among themselves, as they recognized who had just walked into their midst. John, who had been so absorbed in his own pain, was only now starting to lift his gaze. He looked toward the figure who had intervened, his wide eyes filled with a mix of confusion and hope. He didn't understand why this man was standing up for him, but in that moment, it didn't matter. There was a sense of relief, as though the weight of the world had shifted, if only for a brief second. John couldn't help but feel the flicker of something like comfort, like he wasn't completely alone in this battle. Karen, still reeling from the interruption, tried to regain her composure. She turned toward Michael, her voice laced with sarcasm and irritation. "And who do you think you are?" she spat, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You think you can just come here and tell me how to act?" Michael didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I'm not telling you how to act," he replied, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "I'm saying that what you're doing right now is wrong." The weight of his words hung in the air. Karen blinked, visibly caught off guard. She wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by someone like Michael Jordan. Her composure faltered, and she took a half step back, as though reconsidering her approach. "What do you mean, wrong?" she asked, still trying to hold on to her defensive posture. Michael's expression softened, but his conviction never wavered. "The fact is," he began, "John is doing his job. He's trying his best, and you've chosen to humiliate him for it." His words were firm but measured, not with the intent to overpower her, but to make her see the truth of the situation. There's a big difference between stating facts and using them as a weapon. The silence that followed was deafening. The murmurs that had been circulating among the other customers grew louder, but this time the attention wasn't on John or his perceived shortcomings. It was on Karen. People began to shift uncomfortably in line, their eyes now fixed on her, waiting for her to react. Some of the customers who had previously been indifferent now shifted their gaze away, unwilling to be associated with her cruelty. Others, who had been quietly recording the scene on their phones, started to lower them, the realization sinking in that something significant was happening. Karen, now visibly rattled, turned her attention back to John. She hadn't expected this confrontation. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up to her. But Michael Jordan wasn't backing down, and neither was she. She crossed her arms, trying to regain some semblance of control, but the sharpness of her words was now laced with a nervous edge. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this has nothing to do with you," she sneered, trying to regain her position. "I just want fast service, and he's clearly not up to the job." But Michael didn't let her words rattle him. He stepped closer to John, his demeanor shifting from firm to warm, a small but reassuring smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "John," he said, his voice softer now, but no less empowering, "you're doing a great job here. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." John blinked, his tear-grilled eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected someone, especially someone like Michael Jordan, to step in and offer him this much-needed validation. Michael placed a gentle hand on John's shoulder, offering a connection that spoke volumes. "We all have tough days," he said, his voice filled with quiet strength. "But those days don't define who we are." In that moment, John's heart lifted. The words, so simple yet so profound, had a transformative effect. For the first time all day, John allowed himself to believe that he wasn't alone, that he wasn't the sum of his past mistakes or the cruel words others threw at him. He was worthy of respect, he was worthy of kindness, and most importantly, he was worthy of standing tall. Support and encouragement. As Michael's words settled into the air, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the market. It was as though a heavy fog had lifted, and for the first time that day, John felt a sense of lightness. The constant barrage of cruelty and judgment that had weighed down on him now seemed to recede, replaced by a flicker of something he had longed for: respect, understanding, and even kindness. It wasn't just that Michael Jordan, the legend, had stepped in to defend him. It was the way he had done it, with such calm strength, with such an unspoken understanding of the weight John had carried for so long. For John, it was as if the world had momentarily stopped spinning. The harsh words of his past, the echoes of his stepfather's cruel insults, faded into the background. They didn't hold power over him anymore, not in the face of this simple yet profound act of kindness. Michael didn't need to say anything more. His actions alone, his unwavering support for John, spoke volumes. He wasn't just standing up for John in the moment. He was offering him something far greater. He was offering him the opportunity to reclaim his dignity, his self-worth, and his place in the world. John's breathing slowed, his hands no longer trembling. The oppressive weight of his anxiety, which had nearly crippled him just moments before, seemed to dissipate, as Michael's presence grounded him in a way nothing else could. For the first time in a long while, John didn't feel so small. He didn't feel like the vulnerable target of a cruel world. Instead, he stood taller, buoyed by the quiet encouragement of someone who had chosen to see him for who he was. A person, not defined by his limitations but by his effort, his humanity, and his resilience. "John, you're doing great," Michael repeated, his hand still on John's shoulder, his voice now a warm, steady presence that calmed John's nerves. The reassurance in those words wasn't just comforting, it was transformative. John had never heard anyone speak to him like this before. Sure, his family had tried, and his co-workers had been polite, but this felt different. Michael Jordan, a man whose very name symbolized greatness, was telling him that he was enough, that his best was more than enough, and that the judgment of others didn't define him. John nodded slowly, a tear escaping from the corner of his eye. He didn't wipe it away immediately. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened, the pain, the humiliation, and most importantly, the release. He had carried the scars of his past for so long, and now, standing here with Michael's support, he finally felt a glimmer of what it meant to heal, to be seen, to be heard. Karen, still caught off guard by Michael's unwavering presence, seemed to shrink in the face of his confidence. Her harsh words, once so sharp and pointed, now felt hollow, empty. The power she had held in the moment was slipping away, and in its place was the undeniable truth that kindness and respect would always outweigh cruelty. Her discomfort was evident, but it was too late for her. The customers who had once been silent now shifted uncomfortably, their glances now fixed on her. The tide had turned, and it was clear that the power of Michael's intervention had made all the difference. John, now standing a little taller, looked up at Michael, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. I don't know what to say." He couldn't find the words to express the depth of his gratitude, but in his heart, he knew that this moment would stay with him forever. Michael's smile was small but warm. "You don't need to say anything," he replied softly. "Just keep doing what you're doing. You've got this." And with that, the moment passed. The tension in the store slowly began to ease. Karen, visibly shaken, turned away, her anger dissipating into the air like smoke. The other customers, now more aware of the injustice that had taken place, began to shift their attention away from the scene, feeling a sense of relief in the knowledge that what they had witnessed was not acceptable. As for John, he stood there, his heart still racing but no longer overwhelmed. For the first time in a long time, he felt proud of himself, proud of the way he had stood his ground, of the way he had kept going despite everything that had been thrown at him. He had found his strength, and in that moment he realized that no matter what anyone said, no matter how slow he moved or how difficult things might get, he was enough. And Michael Jordan had shown him that. What do you think about the way John was treated, and how would you have reacted if you were in his shoes? Stories like this remind us how important it is to show kindness and stand up for others when they need it the most. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful, heartwarming content, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for even more stories that inspire and remind us of the goodness still present in the world. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest updates. Your support means the world to us, and together we can make a difference.